Mary Carolyn authored a book about Mary Bonner, a distinguished San Antonio woman artist whose etchings are very desirable, and a book about, for those of you who've lived in San Antonio a long time, Rosengren's bookstore, which was the literary center of San Antonio. And Mary Carolyn and I have been friends for a long, long time. We were neighbors in the River Road area. That's where I first got to know her. She's a terribly interesting woman. And she was married to a distinguished architect in Austin for 20 years, and then when he passed away a couple of years ago, she decided to move back to her hometown of San Antonio. And she had always gone to St. Mark's before, but she asked me, I guess, well, actually I talk a lot about St. Paul's, and so she said she wanted to come, and she's become a real member of the congregation there. And Mary Carolyn just cannot stand unanswered questions. And don't ever give her a name. She'll find out the whole history of that person. But Mary Carolyn read the history of St. Paul's in the little book that was written a few years ago by two of the parishioners, and who Roy Jones is mentioned in that book. As being on the vestry several times, I noticed yesterday. But there's a little phrase in the book that said the architect in 1883 was a Mr. Chandler. It wasn't like Mr. John Chandler. It was a Mr. Chandler from Philadelphia. Well, the rest is history.
Yeah.
And so I would very much like for you all to welcome Mary Carolyn George.
And thank you for the invitation to be here with you all. I loved the presentation. I learned a lot. But today this is about St. Paul's and the neighborhood surrounding. And I always think the stories those walls could tell, wow. The 1880s was really a watershed moment, and when a lot of things were happening. But first of all, I want to thank Mark, who is put the PowerPoint together, and Corbett, who is our little group of supporters. Morgan, certainly, and Donna for the invitation. But again, this is about the stories those stones could tell, and it's pretty amazing. Next. The first little mystery, this is a portrait of Mary Coles. Miss Mary Coles, her dates were 1834 to 1920, was the daughter of Edward Coles, the second governor of Illinois. He was famous as the man who saved Illinois from becoming a slave state. In 1822, after he was elected governor, he aroused hostility of the pro-slavery element by successfully advocating the repeal of the black laws of the state, a guarantee that Illinois would always remain a free state. His only daughter, Mary Coles, resembled her father in her strong convictions and fearlessness in holding them. She was alive to new methods and the needs of the time. In her will, she left a generous sum of $145,000 for missionary work among the Indians and Negroes. She also helped fund the building of a church in Shanghai and was supportive of the missionary work of the Episcopal Church worldwide. In 1865, she founded Coles House in Philadelphia, a boarding house for young women who were alone in the city. Her portrait hung in the Victorian parlor until Coles House was closed in 2000. More about the portrait later. During her lifetime, she organized and taught the Tuesday missionary class, which met in her home for 47 years. After Coles House closed, Mary Coles' portrait was sold by an antiquities dealer as a wall space filler, identified only as a 19th century portrait. The present owner made this photograph. The vestry recently approved my suggestion that this painting be acquired for St. Paul's in celebration of her benevolence. Concerning the portrait of the woman in the Victorian lady in the dining room, both Laura Thomas and Bob Jones recall that the unidentified portrait was part of the bequest of the estate of the Paulus family, along with the antique furniture in the 1960s. The story is that Mary Cole's nephew was stationed at neighboring Fort Sam Houston, which was being built at the same time St. Paul's was being built. Isolated, surrounded by a prairie, and we'll see a map in a moment, overgrown with mesquite and cactus. There was no post chapel, there was no Episcopal church, other than St. Mark's downtown, which was completed in 1875. No transportation, other than an old-fashioned wagon drawn by 4 mules. Rumor has it that when military personnel from the northern Union states, as was her nephew, attended St. Mark's, they felt less than welcome. They were still being treated like the enemy. Decades after the Civil War, but remember that Robert E. Lee was one of the founders of St. Mark's. In memory of her mother, Mary Coles provided plans for St. Paul and most of the money to build it. She later provided altar, bishop's throne, holy vessels, font, carpet, hymnals, prayer books, whatever. The extent of her gifts will probably never be known, but they continued until her death. And we have a letter from Bishop William Capers, who was the bishop of the Diocese of West Texas from 1914 to 1943. There's a letter in the archives from Bishop Capers to Mary Coles about 2 months before she died. And it was very clear that they were extremely close friends from way back. Back to his tenure in Philadelphia. All right, next. The architect who designed St. Paul's Episcopal Church. In the history of St. Paul's, he's identified either as a nationally known architect or as Mr. Chandler of Philadelphia, as Morgan said. In response to an inquiry to the Philadelphia chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians, more was learned about his accomplishments. Theophilus Parsons Chandler, Jr. was a Harvard and Paris-trained architect who was commissioned by Mary Coles to design St. Paul's early in his career. It is the only example of his work outside the northeastern U.S. He had the good fortune to marry a DuPont. Did a lot of work for the DuPont family. But he was one of the most influential architects in the Philadelphia region. In 1890, he organized and was the first dean of the University of Pennsylvania architecture program, then and now among the most prestigious professional schools in the U.S. Next. By the way, when I called the SAH in Philadelphia and asked about this Mr. Chandler, they said, "Oh, that's Thorpe." Everybody just called him Thorpe. And I also found out that his drawings and documents were consolidated in the archives of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, and a celebratory exhibit of his work was held in 2010. Copies of the catalog have been deposited in our parish library. Inquiries so far unanswered have been to determine if the original plans of St. Paul's are in the archives, but they haven't answered my letter. Okay. Next. This photograph is from 1935, the 50th anniversary of the founding. Next. Chandler's final work is Christ Church, Idem, which was built from 1916 to 1919. His gift to the Episcopal Diocese of Philadelphia, and constructed to his specifications and with his funding at his home place, a farm on the Conestoga Road. He made the church as plain as he could, a simple old English Gothic church. If it was too elaborate, he said, he would be criticized as a show-off by his neighbors. Right, next. Bird's eye view of San Antonio, 1886, looking northeast. This is a partial view, and we need to, Morgan and I are working on getting a full print of this particular map. But you can see Fort Sam Houston, St. Paul's, and you can also see that the railroads had come in 1877, yeah. The first train into San Antonio was the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio, which entered San Antonio. When it entered San Antonio, 8,000 people marched through the streets in a torchlight parade. Next. Fort Sam was being constructed at the same time on Government Hill, right across the street from St. Paul's. The trouble is now with the security at the post, you can't drive around. But it used to be that everybody would just, drive out and look at the wonder of what was happening. This is the commanding general's. By the way, if you have a question or whatever, just answer, do it. I'm here. This is the commanding general's quarters 6, built in 1880. The photograph dates from the tenure of Brigadier General David Sloan Stanley as commander of the Department of Texas from 1884 to 92. General Stanley wears a white coat, no hat. The contract price for the building was $12,800. Beneficial to the region's economy, strategically located for the military, and an exemplar of a well-planned, healthful, and aesthetically environment. About 1880, there was a campaign through Congress for the consolidation of the Army, urging the abandonment of obsolete posts. The placement of garrisons in the vicinity of large cities was deemed desirable. Heretofore, the military had been scattered to more than 200 small, isolated posts in order to mitigate a dilemma with the so-called Native Americans, now resolved at least so far as the Army was concerned. These were often substandard, poorly maintained, and with sanitation problems. The one little jewel that we all love is Fort Davis in the Davis Mountains, which is a historic monument. It's been restored and so forth. But the strange thing about Fort Davis is that it's surrounded by very high places where the Indians could have had an advantage. After 1880, the protection of the U.S.-Mexico border, where outlawry was now rampant, became a top priority. Does that sound familiar? For 40 years, the citizens of San Antonio had lobbied for a permanent military post and undertook to gather the required land. Now that adequate railroad facilities to transport troops to the frontier when needed, the city could not have been in a better position to profit by the War Department's new consolidation plan. It was determined that the new post should be planned and constructed in concert with local architects and contractors, and that all the money for materials and labor be expended in San Antonio. For the city, for the military, and for the architect Alfred Giles, the 1880s were an auspicious decade, with more than 40 buildings designed by Giles. At Fort Sam Houston, to his credit, under the authority of the Quartermaster, U.S. Army, Department of Texas. A new directive took into consideration topography, local climate, drainage, water, and waste away from the post, and it capitalized on the prevailing breezes. All the buildings were situated to mitigate the effects of the hot Texas climate. To personnel familiar with Army housing elsewhere, the new buildings at Staff Post, arranged around the parade ground, must have appeared luxurious. Next. These buildings have been well maintained and have continued to serve the needs of the commanding general of the military area, ever changing. It is now, of course, medical. So the officers and their families lived here. This is Captain's Quarters, number 15, Staff Post, and it's typical of about 5 other of the houses on Staff Post. At the time St. Paul's was consecrated, many parishioners lived in the neighborhood of the church. The Army was strongly represented in the congregation and on the vestry for several decades. More than half the parishioners were Army officers, enlisted men, or dependents. Next, please. In 1886, the Apache chief Geronimo had been captured in Arizona. With his wife, family, and warriors, he was held prisoner in the quadrangle at Fort Sam Houston and attained celebrity status. The Army promised him full protection. They lived in tents, and sides of beef were brought in to feed them. He later had a private audience with President Teddy Roosevelt and published his autobiography. Next. Well, back to Alfred Giles. And the Episcopal Church. Alfred Giles was a Englishman, trained in England, had practiced professionally, but he came to Texas because he'd had rheumatic fever as a child, and he had respiratory problems. So he quickly became, the cat's meow. He did a huge amount of work, but when I was doing finished my graduate work at UT, I didn't know who to write my thesis on, and so I told my advisor, and he said, well, go look at all the buildings that you've admired, growing up in Central Texas, which I did, and I would look, research each one, and they were all by Alfred Giles. But he'd been dead for 50 years. Even people that were interested in historic preservation couldn't remember him. So, I didn't know where to go from here. I got all these buildings. Most of them were badly maintained. But, what to do about it. So, where I sat at St. Mark's, I always sat in the same place over on the side. And the aunt of my college roommate always sat behind me, Miss Booth. And she would always say, what are you doing? And so one day I said, I have chosen I get goosebumps just thinking about it right now. I have chosen the subject for my thesis. And it's a British architect named Alfred Giles. And she said, he was my father. So that opened up everything.
Wow.
Okay, where are we? Next. In addition to Staff Post, construction commenced on the adjoining infantry post in 1886, including the barracks, which were designed by Alfred Giles. Regrettably, in recent decades, the area has been allowed to fall into disrepair. Next. This is the infantry post garrison's commander's quarters, building 626. The Stillwell House was occupied until 1968, when it was slated for demolition. Vinegar Joe Stillwell occupied the house in the years leading up to World War II. Then he was commander of the U.S. forces in China, Burma, India Theater. In an effort to save the landmark, a group of women literally stood in front of the bulldozers and reactivated the Fort Sam Houston Historical Society. In 1975, Fort Sam Houston had, and still, the largest collection of historic structures of any active U.S. military base. That is, over 700 designated as National Historic Buildings. In 1998, the restoration of the Stillwell House was completed and is now a demonstration project for the Department of Defense, as well as a model of military and civilian cooperation. The San Antonio Conservation Society cooperated fully with people at Fort Sam. Next. West Texas Military Academy was founded by the Reverend J.S. Johnson, Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of West Texas, right across the street from St. Paul's, at Carson and Willow Street, on land owned by the military. It opened in 1893. All 5 buildings were supplied with electric lights, hot and cold water, and ample bathrooms. The architect was, of course, Alfred Giles. The students attended daily chapel at St. Paul's, and the rector, the Reverend Burleson, was also the chaplain of the academy. The school remained on Government Hill until 1911, when it moved to its new campus in Alamo Heights, and now it's at the Dominion, near Camp Bullis. Next. This is the sole surviving academy building at the southeast corner of Quitman and Willow Street. And it really is. You look at the photographs and look at this, and it is, in fact. All right, next. Now, I have to make a confession. I've had a crush on, isn't he adorable? This is Douglas MacArthur. He was in the first class of cadets to enter the South Texas Military Academy in 1893. His father, General Arthur MacArthur, was Commandant of Fort Sam Houston. Note the sergeant stripes. To be an officer in the Cadet Corps, the rules decreed that the cadet must be a dorm prefect. Young MacArthur served as a crucifer at St. Paul's and was number 21 on the church's confirmation rolls. MacArthur graduated first in his class in 1897. And the headmaster called him the brightest student he'd ever known. At the academy, it is interesting to note that in addition to 6 teachers, a school doctor, and a house mother, and rigorous military training, there were three music and dancing instructors. In his biography, he noted, "My studies enveloped me, my marks went higher, and many school medals came my way. But I also learned how little such honors mean when one wins them." He later entered West Point, where he graduated first in his class of 93 in 1903. During World War II, General Douglas MacArthur was Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific and of the UN forces in Korea beginning in 1950. He is one of only 9 to hold the rank of 5-star general. Next. I hate to let that photograph go. He loved athletics and played team sports as much as he could. Here he is lounging in the foreground. He was captain of the Academy's football team, and he was photographed at St. Paul's. You'll notice the windows. Next. He was also a member of the baseball team, standing 3rd from the right. Again, the photograph is at St. Paul's. Next, please. Lambermont. You all know about that. The Edwin Terrell residence, built in 1894. Terrell had served as U.S. diplomat in Belgium under the administration of President Benjamin Harrison and loved the castles of Europe. He commissioned Alfred Giles to design a castle for his family, which then numbered 6 children. Mary Maverick, the daughter of Samuel Augustus Maverick, was the first Mrs. Terrell and the mother of the children. She died in Belgium in 1891. His new bride was the former Lois Lassiter. The house was built for $16,000 and has 26 rooms, including the library, music room, solarium, butler's pantry, access to the wine cellar below, and a ballroom with parquet floors and 9 fireplaces. The style is Richardsonian Romanesque, which was very popular in the 1890s. Note the streetcar tracks, so we're getting better with transportation. Next, please. This is the large, irregularly shaped reception area, an example of the concept then popular of a living hall. The family lived at Lambermont until Terrell's death in 1908. Next. Today, Lambermont is a popular events venue with events benefiting St. Paul's Church and Montessori School. Next. Grayson Street observation car arriving at Fort Sam. By this time, there were 150 streetcar lines radiating from the center of town to proliferating neighborhoods. The postcard is dated 1910. Next. So this is Government Hill neighborhood when it was flourishing, and now it's returning. The Government Hill Pharmacy, which was at the corner of North New Braunfels. Next. The W.H. Bitter's residence at 1719 North New Braunfels, built in 1892, this one by James Riley Gordon, the architect of the Bexar County Courthouse that same year. In 1964, the house was vacated by the last member of the Bitters family, Corbett Holmgreen's relatives. Everybody is Corbett Holmgreen's relative.
Only the bad ones.
In the late 1960s, the St. Paul's Episcopal Church thrift shop briefly utilized the property. It was demolished, can you imagine, in circa 1970 in the wake of construction of the North Pan Am Expressway. Okay, next. So there are other some less distinguished things. Next, a movie theater. And this was at some point the headquarters of the U.S. Automobile Association. Founded in 1922 by a group of Army officers as a mechanism for mutual insurance. They were unable to secure auto insurance because of the perception that they, as military officers, were a high-risk group. It was later expanded to serve all military personnel. We don't have the date. I haven't been able to determine the date of this building, but it was vacant from May of 1956 until January of 1960, when it became headquarters of Fifth Army. Doing this kind of research and putting it together is never an end in itself. It's just an engine to generate more information. And Morgan has come up with a really wonderful sort of analysis of the evolution of the church and where it's going. So this is researched and wait a minute, where is that? In 1952, according to St. Paul's Episcopal Church in San Antonio, that excellent history written by Geraldine Rogers and Susan Ewick, the vestry pondered, could St. Paul's Church be remodeled with greater seating capacity without detracting from its original beauty? The architect Raymond Julian of Syosset, Long Island, New York, was consulted, and his plans included extending the nave into the space where the sanctuary previously stood and building a new, larger sanctuary. This is the church interior that we know today, but it didn't get there right away. Also, an addition to the southwest corner of the church housing a sacristy, priest room, and vesting rooms for the lady and me. This one especially with the church. What is so interesting to me is that in the 1950s, 1960s, Arco, which was out on Broadway almost to 410, was this incredible stained glass studio. And at the same time, they were doing very appropriate, stylistically, stained glass windows for St. Paul's. They were also doing the very contemporary stained glass designed by Cecil Casebeer at St. Luke's. So it was like they could respond to what was appropriate. Now I've tried to track down the archives for Arco, but they seem to have vanished. I checked with Cavallini and they said they didn't think they existed anymore. But it's really such a great story that this powerhouse seems to have passed into nothingness. 9 years later, in 1961, under the leadership of Arthur Mathis, chairman of an every-member canvass, plans for the parish hall and education buildings were discussed. Once again, New York architect Raymond Julian was consulted to plan the expansion, and once again, Arthur Mathis Jr. was appointed supervising architect. Blueprints in the church files indicate that the final, very extensive architectural plans were designed and drawn by Arthur Mathis, architect. On September 13, 1964, the new spaces were dedicated. Brand Hall, the parish hall, and Astoria Hall, the education building, were named for the Brand and Astoria estates, generous donors to the church. The church offices along Grayson Street were also built at that time. These modern additions, in contrast to the original 1883 English country village Gothic style, are monuments to the mid-20th century period of their design and construction. They are light-filled, solidly built, and architecturally honest buildings. The manner in which architect Arthur Mathis connected the original building to the new additions is masterful. The delightful interior garden courtyard brings natural light into the interior space of the Brand Parish Hall, while a screen of terracotta tiles filters out the overhead sun. High clerestory windows follow the lines of the folded plate roof structure, an impressive architectonic blend of structure and aesthetic design. Astoria Hall, the education building, is now known as the Jones Astoria Hall in honor of R. Roy Jones, Jr., who generously donated the funds to truly renovate and refresh the building. In 2005, St. Paul's Episcopal Church offered the valuable classroom space to the idealistically founded Montessori School, now known as St. Paul's Episcopal Montessori School. The well-proportioned former Sunday school classes, with their generous bands of operable windows and doors to the exterior, were easily adapted to the unique needs of the Montessori school. Perfect. Doing it right the first time is the most economical way to go. Have a flexible, ever-evolving master plan, accomplishment in increments if necessary, and be respectful of the inherent beauty of what is. No grand statements. So we'll see what happens next. Thank you all.
Thank you, Idaho. The reason I wanted Mary Carolyn to come in is because as we move forward, I think it's very important to know where we came from.
Exactly.
And so when I heard she had done this presentation, I was very thrilled to have her, not because my house was on it, but because, but because it really gave us some history of what was happening. So thank you so much for coming. And they will be joining us for dinner. So
Yes.
if we have questions for her, I ask you to keep them for then because we've got to keep moving today.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.